professor in the Department of Biology. She's a colleague of mine for many years. And she teaches classes in behavioral ecology and in grant writing for graduate students. She received a PhD in biology from the University of New Mexico, and she's been a professor at University of Florida biology since 2001. And her research focuses on the evolution of mating systems, as you will see, and sexual selection. And also she works on studies that link genes and behavior, comparative studies using phylogenetic approaches. So sort of the history, the evolutionary history of traits. And today she is talking about bigger, really better, why males are larger and more colorful than females, most of the time.
I'll go over that. All right, thank you, Jane, for that introduction. Let's go back to Charles Darwin, who came up, of course, with this idea about natural selection to try and understand the differences he saw among organisms and how they might have actually got there. But even Darwin felt sometimes there were traits that just didn't seem to quite fit. So here we have a long-tailed widow bird with this very enormous tail. And of course, when this bird tries to fly, you can actually see what a hardship that is. And Darwin thought, it's really hard. How would natural selection select something that basically makes it almost impossible for a bird to fly away from a predator or to fly out and forage and get food? Oops, wait, I'm taking the wrong button here. All right, and such kinds of traits exist throughout the animal kingdom. You're all going to quickly realize I like birds. I mostly focus on birds, but I recognize this goes throughout the animal kingdom. Insects with these are hind legs, and look at these huge elaborations that must really hinder their ability to move. This is the extinct Irish elk with this enormous antlers that weighed very heavily. And of course, we have things like this mannequin here, a little bird that is really brightly colored and stands out in stark contrast to its surroundings, i.e. a predator might not find it very hard to identify that bird if they were potentially a little bit hungry. And so if you're thinking about natural selection, what are things that organisms should exhibit to allow them to survive longer and reproduce more? None of these traits actually seem to fit into that kind of paradigm, at least on the surface. And therefore, Darwin felt there needed to be an additional mechanism besides natural selection, and he termed this other process sexual selection. And in essence, when we're talking about sexual selection, this is selection for traits such as elongated tails, bright colorations, fancy head ornaments, and things like that, that are present in one sex and lead to increased mating success relative to individuals that might lack those. Going through here, this is a red jungle fowl. And if we look up close, we often maybe say one individual lacks some of these traits, but usually it means that they're just a little bit insufficient. They have it, like this male here, that's this guy. He certainly got the head ornaments, but his are not nearly as elaborate, impressive, large, or obvious to a female. And certainly research, including research I've been involved in, suggests that if you gave a female a choice of these two males, about 95% of them would very rapidly pick this guy over that one. And so it can be very dramatic, this sort of preference or selection that gives some males a mating advantage over others. So what we're really talking about when we talk about sexual selection are mating skews. That one individual gets a lot of matings, and that consequently means maybe other individuals get few or none. These are greater prairie or greater sage grouse. All of these are males out here displaying. And what research has shown is that when a female comes up, she might pick one of these to mate with. The next female will probably mate with that same individual, and so forth, i.e., all these guys are sitting out here. One of them tends to be lucky, and the other one's less so. It's not quite so bad in the real world, because one of the things that we have found out from longer term studies is one guy may do really well for a week or two, and then he just can't maintain that top spot and be the top guy, and there's some turnover. But nevertheless, some males mate with a lot of females, and some males may not mate with any going through. All right, before I go much further, I want to set up a basic difference between males and females. You may sit there and think, well, I know the difference between a male and female, but biologically, a female is the one that invests more in what we call gametes. Those are the eggs or the sperm. Whichever sex produces the big one with lots of nutrients that's really costly to produce, we call females. The other type that might produce very small little structures, the sperm, is defined as the male. Interestingly, there are species where you can't define males and females, and they call those mating types, where it takes still two different ones to come together, but they each contribute equally, and so we can't define one as a male or a female. All right, why is this important? Females, because eggs tend to be very costly, are limited in the number of offspring that they can produce. Sure, there's some variation in that, but in general, females tend to be limited into the amount of energy that they can put into those eggs. Let's not even go on beyond the egg stage if there's parental care, but just the basic energy of producing them. All right, the term we often say is sperm is cheap. All right, males have the ability to produce a huge amount of sperm, and that means males, let's just say, can spread it around to many different females, and without always huge amounts of energy investment into at least that part of the component there. And that makes it possible for males to often mate with many, many, many different females, whereas a female sometimes might be a little more limited because she's limited in the number of total offspring that she can produce. Therefore, sexual selection typically, and yes, I say typically, acts on males, because males are usually the one where you can get a bigger difference between those who have it and mate with lots of females and those who don't. Females are much more likely, even if some mate a little more than others, most females reproduce, so they usually get at least some matings, and usually there's not a big difference across females, usually. I admit there are always exceptions. But for the convenience of this talk, I'm going to be basically presenting the ideas in this paradigm that it's usually males in which these processes are acting, because that's really the most common case and where it's really easiest to see this. All right. One more little thing to get through is when we talk about sort of mating systems. Species vary hugely in the patterns of pairing. We do have some species where the common pattern is one male mates with many females. This takes a huge variety, and that simple categorization can still lead to huge numbers of things. Sometimes there are what we refer to as long-term pair bonds, species that may spend the entire breeding season together, or maybe even together multiple years, where one male still will have a stable set of females. Sometimes it's very short-term, i.e. the duration of copulation is the total extent in which they spend together. But again, one male may mate with many females. We have systems of sort of promiscuity, where both sexes might be out there mating multiply, but again, even in these systems, typically males may often mate much more frequently and with multiple different females, and females maybe only one or a few going through there. All right, And of course, I do want to acknowledge there are other patterns. There are species like this spotted sandpiper, where it's the female who gets to have a couple of males she mates with. So although it's not the common pattern, yes, these things can reverse in some species going forward. Of course, we may often think about many species in terms of more monogamy. In monogamy, where you have one male and one female together, you might think there's very little role for sexual selection because every male is paired with a female, every female is paired with one male, and therefore we won't get many skews. And there clearly are species where that is definitely true. Even genetics have borne out that that's the pattern. But things like these house finches here actually find ways around that, and although they may appear monogamous, what we refer to as socially monogamous, when you look at them, they seem to be dutiful pairs that remain together. In actual fact, in some of those, the males are out with other females, and in some cases, here we have two males. We know that females like redder males, and potentially some females mated to a guy like this may end up copulating there, which could be this male may get many more matings than some of the other males in the population. And genetically, we know some males sit there, they feed offspring, they work really hard to raise young, and none of those young are theirs. So certainly this can be really common, and in some species pretty extreme, that just because it appears everyone's getting it doesn't always end up being the way it works. All right, now we've set some of the framework, let's come back to Charles Darwin's ideas about sexual selection. And Darwin talked about sort of two ways this might actually go through. He talked about a process where you might get competition in one sex, very often maybe males, for possession or access to the other sex. We often refer to this as intra-sexual selection. Intra means within, so within one sex there's competition. Often people refer to this as male-male competition because, again, it mostly occurs with males. Doesn't have to, but that's, again, there. I'm going to use male-male competition because the other process is preference by one sex, usually females, for certain males going through. That's referred to as intersexual, between. I am sure I will screw up intra and inter if I do them, so I am using male-male competition and female choice to keep myself on track going through here. So let's start talking a little bit by male-male competition. You certainly potentially may have seen this or seen nature specials. It's easy to sort of think about how males might compete, and they might compete in ways then that allow them to exclude certain males from areas where females are. Males sometimes guard females, so other males can't get access to them, and it can lead to various kinds of weaponry, obvious here, less so on these red jungle fowl, but males have these spurs down here that can actually inflict quite a bit of damage. I want to mention that although we think about this in terms of weapons that we can see or bigger sizes, this can actually lead to competition between the sperm, the male components here, inside, say, a female reproductive tract. And so we actually think this process might lead to things such as males producing more sperm or larger sperm or faster sperm that will actually compete against other male sperm inside the female reproductive tract. So it may take many different forms going through. But the important thing about this is, I think inherently, it's very easy to see that the outcomes of this competition could lead to differences between the sexes because there's strong selection for males to be big, strong selection for males to possess weaponry, strong selection for these kinds of differences that will give them an advantage when fighting with others of the same sex. And this idea about male-male competition and its role in driving differences between the sexes is pretty well accepted. Let's talk about this other process in sexual selection, sort of mate choice, or as I'm referring to it as female choice. We already talked about this guy, our long-tailed widow bird. This is the female. So you can see something has led to big differences between these two species. And if we go mostly birds, but throughout the animal kingdom, we find this a lot of places. Here's a male bird of paradise doing this fabulous display. Whoops, whoa, all right. Need to make sure I'm pressing the right thing. This is the female. We get very bright colorations. This is a pair, male and female. These fairy wrens, big obvious differences. Many people may be aware of peacocks, and the peahens are much less colorful. This works with these beautiful peacock spiders, kind of jumping spiders, in fish, insects. Sometimes the colors may not be that colorful, but we're still seeing noticeable and obvious differences between the sexes going through here. These are a pair of eclectus parrots. Again, very colorful and big differences between them. And the idea then is that female choice for males that look different may be driving many of these patterns that we see between the sexes going through here. But this idea of female choice has been sort of sometimes generated a lot more controversy than male-male competition. And in particular, what's generated that controversy is a thought about why should females prefer one male over the other, and what are the benefits that a particular female might get. And it goes actually to the point that some people have said that this may not be adaptive. This may not be something that's favored by natural selection. Females may actually like beauty, and they may have some aesthetic sense where they're attracted to certain individuals, not attracted to other individuals, and that's their choice. Other people argue that females should be making decisions that are adaptive, that in some ways benefit the female, lead to, say, producing more offspring or offspring that are better quality. So she should be making good choices, not just looking at looks going through. And potentially, you might argue there could be some other reasons going through. This debate about beauty, I won't say beauty over brains, but in essence, looking at beauty, looking at some other attribute that might actually be reflective of male quality or what he can give a female, has been going on since people first started using the term sexual selection. Charles Darwin favored and really developed ideas about aesthetics and very much felt that females might just be attracted to some of these traits that males had that may have then led to, over time, the evolution of these elaborate, exaggerated, colorful males for no other reason than beauty. About a contemporary of Charles Darwin was a guy named Alfred Russel Wallace. He actually came up with a very similar idea of natural selection to that of Darwin. They published them, each of their ideas at the same time. So they were very much thinking in similar ways. Where they disagreed quite a bit was about this idea of sexual selection and whether it really existed. And in particular, this idea came down to Wallace feeling that females only made choices that should increase their fitness and that there should be favored by natural selection. And therefore, there is no sexual selection. Everything is natural selection. Females make what, over evolutionary time, are adaptive decisions. Going on. These ideas are still in argument. In 2017, a professor at Yale, Rick Prum, published a book on beauty, basically arguing back to some extent to Darwin's early ideas. And again, saying maybe this goes on, whereas I think many evolutionary biologists might lean a bit more towards Wallace, the idea that sometimes these things need to have some adaptive benefits. So these are long-standing and ongoing arguments going through. Well, let's talk about this idea of non-adaptive choice. And possibly because of the discourse between Darwin and Wallace's sort of denouncement of the ideas, really outside of sort of Darwin's promotion, there was very little emphasis on sexual selection in research for many, many years. And then in 1930, a mathematician actually developed a sort of model, a process to explain how you might get non-adaptive female choice. And I'm going to briefly run you through that little process that's often referred to as runaway sexual selection. And in essence, you first have a trait that might have begun initially through natural selection. That males, as tails got longer, might be able to fly better. Slightly longer tails might give you better aerodynamics. Over time, as the tails get a bit longer, females key in on those, and they begin to prefer males with longer tails. And this might actually have a genetic component, where there's sort of a gene that some females possess that causes them to favor longer tails. So tails continue to get, which I should remember to do it here, larger until they get to a point where males can fly really well. And if tails get any larger, actually, selection will come against males. Maybe it gets too heavy to fly effectively going forward. And one of the things that needs to happen here, though, is that you get this preference, and somehow it needs to become sort of linked with the particular genes that are causing male tail length to be longer. And we do know these kinds of linkages, genetic linkages can occur. They've been documented for other kinds of traits. So it's not an impossibility that this might go through there. And eventually what happens is, even though this is optimal, they keep getting longer. Tails get longer and longer and longer going through because females always want the longest tail going through. And so the males with the longest tails are the only ones who get matings, and therefore their genes for long tails are what get passed on to the future generations. Because individuals with long tails produce daughters that like long tails, and it becomes a kind of snowball or runaway process going forward. So what is the evidence? Someone actually came up with a mechanism. This actually might link some of Darwin's ideas that it doesn't have to be adaptive with a process that could actually work. We didn't have to say that, animals just have beauty sense, which many people felt was attributing a lot of human attributes to the animals. We could actually see a mechanism. But it requires both that there be a preference for a trait and that genetic linkage or some linkage occurs between that trait and the gene that produces the trait and the female preference. There are a few studies that have demonstrated this. One of the sort of classical ones are these stalk-eyed flies. This is the eye, this is the other eye. I know these things are a little weird looking. Females like the guys with their eyes way out here, not the guys with their eyes in here, going through. And Gerald Wilkinson actually was able to demonstrate that there appeared to be a linkage between the preference and the development of the trait in males that might suggest this process. But there are really very few processes going through here. What then still remains, though, is can there be choice purely based on aesthetics or beauty, independent of this kind of genetic linkage? And Fisher himself invoked natural selection in the first part of his early steps as well. So might females just like these various kinds of birds of paradises and fancy displays? Well, there may actually be mechanisms that might drive a female to do that, that actually are good proximate reasons where females might go through and make some of these kinds of decisions going through here. So some traits may just stimulate the sensory system. A trait may get all of your options, the little receptors back in your eyes that pick up coloration signal coming through, it may stimulate them all. Or it may really provide a strong signal. It may be a sound that's perfectly at the frequency your ear maximally picks up, and so you key in on it really readily. And therefore, one idea is that when males evolve a trait, if it is something that really matches a female's existing sensory system, she's going to go for that male. And therefore, male traits may often be those that really hit these sorts of sensory biases and that attract a female. And we know in some cases that there are things like females of species that eat red berries tend to like males with red coloration. Well, if you like berries and you want ripe berries, you need to key in on the bright orange and reds. Therefore, females should already have eye systems, visual systems keyed to red that are really good at picking up red. So of course, when suddenly one male evolves a new color and it's red and he comes out showing it, all the females are gonna be like, whoa. And they're gonna like that guy there because they're attracted. Their sensory system is sort of biased or primed to particular traits or considerations. And it's certainly true that we know this can go on and may explain the origins of preferences, the first things that attract a female. And so this may even be the first step for a Fisherian runaway process to get going, or a process where females start to key in. The question that still remains is if this trait is actually counter to natural selection, it's a trait that would be selected against through natural selection, will it really persist over time? And I think many people feel probably not. If you like the red males because you're attracted to red, but all the red males get eaten by predators, the process has got to stop at a certain point. And so sensory biases may explain at least some of this process and certainly could be a mechanism, but whether really it's a long-term process and really whether this idea of aesthetics and beauty plays out over the long haul to lead to the wide variety of colors and patterns and traits that we see is probably not something that really ends up being very common. All right, so now let's talk about this other idea of adaptive female choice. Because this is the one where Wallace said this is really what's going on. Natural selection can explain everything. Obviously, over evolutionary time, females that make good decisions that get them sort of mates that contribute and help the female increase her fitness or produce offspring who have high fitness is the way then to go. And so this idea has been really less controversial going through because, of course, we see that in addition to looking hot, this male, say in this case, she says he's also really bold, and a bold male maybe will be an individual that will boldly go out and get food or good at defending a territory that protects the females. So you get these kinds of benefits going through. And we can think about this in terms of sort of simple, direct things that come directly to the female that really increase her fitness. So males may be able to provide more resources, or some males may provide more resources to a female. Any female who mates with that particular male gets a lot of resources. And don't start talking about, attraction to men with big bank accounts and things like this. Those are resources. They can help a female's fitness, and therefore you can see that kind of direct benefit coming through here. In some species, males even transfer sort of spermatophores that contain sperm, but also nutrients in the female that can be used. Some males do nuptial feeding and provide food to the female that may help alter some of her decisions going through. And or for species like many birds, where there's a territory, it's got food resources on it, a male who's got a good territory might be able to have a territory that provides more food for offspring, and or he may be good at keeping away predators or keeping competitors from coming in and taking that food, that directly increases a female's fitness. Now, I set this up earlier when I first introduced these ideas about sexual selection to this idea of male-male competition. Males fight, and that makes them bigger, stronger. We think of female choice as often leading to more colorful, more elaborate big tails. But clearly, probably, female choice, no reason it can't also potentially drive males that are more aggressive and larger. And people also argue, though, that sometimes coloration and some of these other, big tail may also be indicators to females that this male will be providing more direct benefit if there are correlations going through there. All right, I've talked about something that I think may be pretty easy to grasp, this idea of direct benefits. You get something tangible. We also talk a lot, and much of the research on female choice gets at this idea of indirect benefits. Remember, I mentioned species where the entire duration that the male and female interact is the time it takes to copulate. And so the female's not getting a lot from that male. And so, but in some of those kinds of systems, we still see these males that are bright, that are elaborate, that do these fancy, energetically costly displays. And the idea then is they may be giving indirect benefit going through, which is this idea that if your mate is of high quality, he's going to have offspring that are high quality. They're going to get your good genes from that male, and you will actually produce offspring who have that male's good genes. So a female may not get anything directly from that male, but indirectly, her fitness goes up because she gets his genes. And people have developed some sort of models to describe how this might work with things like sexy sons, that females may mate with an attractive male because they'll produce attractive sons, where their ideas have got truth in advertising, that male sort of coloration advertises truthfully his sort of inequality and why he would be a good mate going forward. A question, though, is then, are these males really better? Are the colorful males higher quality? If you can produce a long tail, are you really better than a male whose tail is sort of a little shorter going through there? So we mentioned red jungle fowl here, where males have these big colorful combs going through. Females, as I mentioned earlier, really like males with big red combs. If you give them a small comb and a large comb, they're pretty decided, and they decide definitively. The females squat and ask for a copulation of this guy and ignore that guy. She makes a pretty clear decision going through there. Interestingly, combs, to get that big and red, require testosterone. If you have more testosterone, your combs get a little bit bigger and a little bit redder. So a female choosing that male is choosing a guy who's got lots of testosterone. When a male gets sick, his testosterone levels drop, the combs get paler, they get smaller. As a matter of fact, poultry farmers, sometimes if they see a male's comb getting pink, might isolate that male because they know it often means he might be sick. So it's a very easy visual cue, but it's also a cue here where you could see how this, what in our eye might appear to be a purely aesthetic, beautiful trait here, actually can tell the female something meaningful about a particular male. This male actually is healthy, he's in good nutrition, he can grow this gorgeous looking comb. We might also expect that one of the other ways you might think about costly is that if males can produce and maintain these big, elaborate traits, that suggests something about their quality. If I can survive as a long-tailed widow bird with a tail like this, aren't I demonstrating that I got something that maybe a male whose tail is this much can't do? And an idea here is that if a low-quality male tries to produce the big tail, he's not going to survive very well. He doesn't have the quality to get away with that, and therefore he may die, he may find himself subject to predators and so forth because he probably can't maintain that trait going forth. You know, you might not be able to stay quite so colorful, and if you're not healthy enough to, say, avoid predators and be a target of them. So this may work out in a number of different kinds of ways. People have also kind of gone through and evaluated whether you might have better offspring, because of course, what do we say? Females may make choices not that benefit the females directly, but they really mean, I've done the best I can for the offspring I've produced. And I've tried to give them the best head start in life by making sure they've got good genes going forth. And therefore, people have also looked, although it's a little harder because you have to follow the offspring through, but sometimes try to follow through. Are these offspring actually better? If I mate with the reddest of the red males, do my offspring actually survive better? Do they grow faster? Are they bigger? Are they in better nutrition going forth? And certainly, sometimes that's the case. As a woman, I sometimes dislike these arguments because, of course, offspring health and quality also depends on female quality and female investment. Her genes are also mixed into there. So sorting out whether this really is the male's good genes or whether it's the female good genes is obviously really challenging. And in species, of course, where females provide a lot of parental care to offspring, that may sometimes make up for all kinds of low quality genes if she can actually give them better food than some other female. So it's not really very definitive, but certainly it's something you might predict and something you might expect if females were really able to kind of choose male quality going through. So does good genes work? Was Alfred Wallace right? And certainly we know that there is evidence that females do make decisions. They can very strongly, in some studies, go one way and ignore another way. There are quite a few studies that have found possible links with quality indicators, such as current health, or, gee, we think this trait is costly to produce, but it's hard to get that data. So we really actually don't have many studies, don't quite get there. You know, they can't, it's just hard to figure out what is male quality and how do we accurately measure it going forward. But there are a number of studies that certainly suggest this can go on, although very few rather are able to really track it down to specific genes and say this male's got gene A, and he's thumbs up, and this one's gene B, and he's thumbs down. As we get better and better with our genetics, you know, we're starting to be able to possibly move toward really seeing, can we find evidence that this is really going on? So I started off with this. Why do we see such big differences between males and females of many, many species? And yes, it's clear that sexual selection has probably had a major impact on the differences in appearance, leading to things such as these very brightly colored male hummingbirds that are fabulous and colorful and have sometimes very elaborate, complex displays going through. But interestingly, while there are many studies that support this idea that female choice, or in some cases, male-male competition can drive these patterns, there are also a number of studies that can't find any evidence that's actually true. And I'm puzzled about why, in some cases, males might look the way they do and be so different from females. Well, it's important to recognize whenever you're thinking about evolution, is that organisms need to go through and survive in many different ways. There's obviously sexual selection, might be acting, but there are many ways natural selection acts on organisms and many other processes that go through. So Wallace, in his anti-female choice ideas, actually argued that sometimes in birds, selection is not on males to be brightly colored. Selection is on females to avoid predators. If you're sitting on a nest in a tree and you are bright red, you are just asking potentially for a predator to eat you, at least the visual predator. And so maybe we think of this as why are males bright? He should ask the question is, what are the processes that make females dull? And actually some studies have suggested in some groups of birds that female color changes more over evolutionary time than male color does, and females get duller and duller. And all of these groups of birds are ones where both males and females are wildly brightly colored. So certainly being colorful is not always a process potentially of sexual selection and not always something that natural selection may select against going through. There are actually many, many species of birds that are very brightly colored in both sexes going forward. We also know that there are other processes that affect things like size, in the sense that sometimes males and females may forage on different foods, and possibly because that way they don't compete with each other. Males could be larger because they take larger food, females smaller because they take smaller food. There are actually all sorts of different ways people have explored some of these things about different kinds of selective pressures to avoid predators, energy requirements, and so forth that may drive differences in size outside of male-male competition. Different habitats, maybe females may tend to inhabit one area and males in another, and that may select for differences in appearance. And of course, we get things like many hawks, where actually females are typically much larger than males, sometimes being at least 30% heavier than males. And so clearly other processes are going on in terms of what's driving differences between some of the sexes going forth here. So while we might think that it's likely that sexual selection has been important, we also need to constantly recognize, to be honest, the world's an amazingly complex place. Any organism out there has 100 different things that are causing selection on it at any one time. Finding a mate and reproducing are clearly important. If you don't do that, you've hit a Darwinian dead end. You have no fitness. And yet, at the same time, organisms need to be getting food. They need to be avoiding predators. They need to be adjusting to climates and various kinds of processes. And all of these other things may sometimes factor into at least some of the differences we see between the sexes. And certainly where people are now beginning to try to look more comprehensively, we're realizing the story's not always quite as simple as we thought. So there are a lot of reasons that lead to this beautiful diversity and cool patterns that we need to be aware of. Probably many of them drive back to that essential point of getting a mate, but we need to make sure we recognize others going through as well. And with that, I will wrap up and ask if there are any questions.
Okay, questions?
Yes, so differences. I was thinking, I just saw a male indigo bunting the other day, and they're very brilliantly blue in the breeding season, but this time of year they're pretty much all brown. And so that is an outsider of what you described today, I would say. Yes?
Well,
I mean, they're being protective of themselves when it's not breeding season, but that would indicate that they think the females like that blue color.
I would agree with you. And I think this is exactly why many people think that things such as female choice probably are really important, even though in some cases we can't always we don't understand always why or what the female gets out of it. That's been really challenging. And I can't tell you the hundreds and hundreds of studies that have come through, and the few really clear examples are very small. What we do know, though, is females often do. And I think evidence like this, when species, I mean, many things get rid of their bright coloration outside of the mating season. Some species with really long tails in birds drop some of those long feathers and things like that. Clearly suggests that other things are going on, and some species have found ways of better balancing the natural selective pressures, trying to be cryptic, trying to avoid heavy, weaponry or elaborate ornamentation outside of the breeding season by getting rid of them. Then that really suggests, yes, the breeding season is what's driving some of that. So I didn't say that wasn't important. There are certainly, though, probably places where people have thought that was what was going on that we're not really finding convincing evidence for. We also have to remember that many traits evolved a long time ago. And it may have been really important to females at one point, and females may not look at it now. Once every male is bright blue, well, now can you really tell them apart very well? And so there are ideas that females may shift what they look at over time, but once you've got all the males blue, there they are, they're blue. And so we don't detect evidence of it. Doesn't mean that wasn't at one point a key force going through. But you're right, this issue of breeding season versus non is definitely evidence in favor of these ideas.
Hi. It seems to me that since the males are the ones that are variable in terms, the female selects the male, the genes that are passed on and the variations that occur in a species are due to the male rather than the female, because the females all probably have the same, but the male, the ones they select, those are the traits that are going to be passed down. Am I getting my point across?
So yes, I mean, for something like tail variation, obviously there's selection and maybe long tail. Now remember, every offspring has a gene that they inherit from dad and a gene from the mother, but over time the idea is that even your female offspring will carry that gene for long tails and have that ability to pass it down. And so over time we'd expect, yes, both the female and the male will be passing down some of the same traits, but that on average, it's the males that are driving that difference. If a male has long traits, even if the female doesn't, she has to, the offspring might receive that.
There's a question on Zoom that says, have studies on the, have studies tested Antarctic penguins in which sexual differences are not striking?
I don't know of anyone that's tested this in penguins, which would be harder to study for some of these. People have looked, though, at species where the two sexes are the same, going through there, and they do find sometimes that there are preferences. Matter of fact, in some of those species, people have detected preferences of males for certain females as well as females for certain males. I think the problem in some of those is this just because there's a preference doesn't necessarily mean you'll drive that sexual selection process. Sexual selection process really depends upon that big skew in mating success, because it means that the male with, say, the long tail, the gene for long tail, if he's the only one who gets to mate one year, every offspring has the potential of inheriting that gene. So it very quickly can spread through there. In some of these other species, it may be that there are choice processes, but whether there's really that kind of skew isn't clear. But as I mentioned, some things look monogamous, they look the same. There are sometimes hidden processes going on, and which males maybe is a bit more successful in attracting other males' mates to mate with him might have some of these differences there. We also think about this in terms of not just appearances, display behaviors like vocalizations and dances and so forth that may also sometimes evolve or be elaborated in ways that we don't visually initially see in species that otherwise look the same. So it can certainly play its way out in multiple different ways going through. And a lot of species look the same, but males produce, say, very elaborate songs that people think may be due to sexual selection.
Other questions? I'd like to know, I'll come there in a minute, what the explanation for the hawk differences in size are.
Boy, there are a handful of those going through. Some of them have to do with the fact that many hawks are highly migratory, they fly long distances, and that weight can be essentially energetically costly for that. Females may need it to produce sufficiently large eggs. Males may not. And therefore, one idea is that this is driven by selection for different weights in them, processes like migration. That if a female becomes smaller, she produces smaller eggs that produce smaller offspring. You don't necessarily want that, but that males can become smaller there. There are also ideas about differences in foraging, but why it goes that direction, though, doesn't make sense there. Interestingly, this is true in hawks. It's also true in falcons and eagles, which are related to hawks. People used to think that hawks, eagles, and falcons evolutionarily were all closely related. Now we know they are not. And so probably the selection that has driven this in hawks and eagles is separate, or it occurred independently of what's going on in falcons. And so it wasn't even like once that something happened and now it's persisted because once it occurred, everything that was a descendant species was sort of stuck with that. It's clear that this is probably something that is adaptive, but yes, there are ecological reasons people have given, physiological reasons people have given to explain some of this as well. But some of the ideas have also focused on weight in part because there's some asymmetries in the gonads that also go along with some of these that people have suggested that you only develop one gonad, again, as a weight-saving mechanism that is common in hawks and falcons, but rare in other birds and things there. That, in my mind, make the weight issue something, and maybe migration and some of these other things likely components of some of this.
Any other questions? Oh, okay.
So last week we learned about titmice and their culture and how smart they are. And so I'm wondering, are we just projecting onto birds, and they really are much more observant and much more going on in their selection than we've even begun to get a hold of?
Yes. I mean, I think absolutely many organisms have much more going on than we've typically attributed to them. I don't say conscious always, but they're clearly making sort of decisions. They're incorporating a lot of information, not just titmice, but many others that seem to have, in many species, good long-term memories of events and really fascinating spatial abilities like the titmice have and things like this. Complex communications and often recognitions of individuals, and they respond differently to some individuals than they do to other individuals. And it seems I rarely go to like the bird meetings that I don't hear about some new species that someone has found that they have some new ability that you're like, wow, I hadn't known that. And these are not always species that on the surface you would think, oh, well, these are, you know, like crows, which we know to be really smart. These are some of these other things going through. And there's a fascinating researcher in Oxford, and she's actually, from a psychology background, she's worked on young children and their ability to start, say, thinking to the future and planning to the future. And she studied jays. And she actually finds that a jay has the cognitive ability of about a 5-year-old, 4 or 5-year-old.
Wow.
In terms of you can actually teach them that they will start to plan ahead for like future events, and they'll know things are going to happen. And that shows up in children at 4 to 5, where they start to realize, and you say, no, we're going to wait and do this, that they start to make similar kinds of decisions. So yeah, I think that's pretty fabulous. These things are really smart. So
Okay, there's one over here.
Do birds have a sense of smell? And if so, would that factor into the mating choices?
So, thank you.
Discussing
This
this
is
at
a
lunch.
project I almost tried to put a grant in on at one point. Yes, some birds have a phenomenal sense of smell. And we know if you ever go out on, you know, in areas where there are things like petrels and albatrosses, people have dropped like drops of fish oil, or Jane was telling me about one where they dropped chum, you know, fish refuse, and birds that are not even in sight, petrels and albatrosses, will fly in within minutes. I mean, you can't even see them on the horizon, and they come in. And they come in because they pick up those odorants that get wafted out to them. Turkey vultures, again, phenomenally good at doing this. The dogma is that birds don't smell. I think it's the wrong dogma. It's like we say, oh, these are dumb animals. And yet I think many do. They may not, in some cases, many species may not use smell excessively. But yes, I have wondered sometimes whether that smell is also important. We know you put out chemical cues. Humans put out chemical cues. We may not be conscious, but we sometimes respond to the chemical cues that other humans put out. Yeah, you're making decisions you didn't even know about based on these kinds of things. And so there's no reason to think, even though birds maybe don't have phenomenally great senses of smell, neither do we relative to many other animals, that they aren't picking up some of these. And these are ideas about that sometimes birds may be making mating decisions based on trying to find males that maybe are genetically a little different from them, you know? And maybe they detect some of that through some of the different kinds of chemical compounds that are coming off these individuals. And it's a really hard thing, I think, to test. But I wonder if in many of these cases where we can't find evidence of what females are doing, but they're doing something, whether some of these kinds of what you might almost think of as hidden sensory systems, they're tapping into sensory systems we're not thinking of, and utilizing those going through. But certainly I had a student who was working on spider behavior, and they can tell things, males, just by getting a piece of paper that a female has been on, show preferences for virgin, papers that have had virgin females on them over papers that have mated females on. You know, immature females, they can tell differently from mature females purely by chemical odorants that we can't detect, but they're making decisions based on that. So yeah, I think birds can do that as well.
Okay, I have a question and a comment, and I'm going to ask the question first before I forget it, and then you know, you were talking about the birds, and everybody's blue, the males, but there's behavior also, and that can be taught or genetic. And I was just wondering, I'm not asking you to tell, I'm asking you, have you seen anything about evolutionarily, like in sage grouse, you know, it may not just be the biggest one, maybe the one that does the best dance, which came first evolutionarily? And then my other comment was, me as a biologist, as a mammalogist, I had to think backwards, because birds, the sex chromosomes are backwards, that the male has the 2 Z's and the female has the Z and the W, and that makes it even more confusing for me. But if you could make any comments about behavior versus appearance.
So this behavior versus appearance thing is, something many people have argued. And now what we do, you know, when people, Bill Jane briefly alluded to phylogeny, trying to understand evolutionary relationships, and people have used that to try to understand what are the pathways of trait gains or changes over time. And using that in some cases, you know, you can get some estimates of, body size we think enlarged here, and this particular maybe display behavior came later going through there. I do that kind of work. And I do that kind of work, but I also admit there are big error bars in our ability to understand that and try to trace those kinds of evolutionary patterns. For a long time, the dogma was that genes that created appearance, changed your color, your size, were things that probably evolved very slowly because, you know, they required all these anatomical shifts, and that behaviors should probably evolve very fast and change readily and be easily gained because, you know, it's just, I guess, a few neurons going through. I'm not sure what the logic was behind that. But actually, when people have looked at this, very often elements of displays seem to have occurred early, and although they're shifted and modified over time, in at least some species, those display behaviors seem to show less change over evolutionary time than some of the appearance things. And I think that makes perfect sense. If I do a display like this, and it attracts a female, and I start to then do this, and all the females look at me and I have no reproductive success, that display is not lasting. There's strong reasons why we'd expect displays shouldn't change very much over evolutionary time, because the last thing you want to do is change your display in a way that means you have no fitness. So yeah, I think there may be some exceptions that flip that, but I think many people now feel that behaviors tend to evolve a little bit more slowly, and that may mean that they sometimes come and are retained over longer evolutionary times.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And next week, we will have Nick Kaiser, also from biology, and he will be talking about the effects of parasites and diseases on animals and their responses to these natural selection acting on them in terms of disease and parasites. Okay, well, thank you very much. Really appreciate. Very interesting.